I know.
Um,
I'm the same way.
I think it's recording now. All
It
right.
is. Yep. It just prompted it. It gave me a dialog box. So
Yeah. I mean, this is like for a possible FOSSA blog that we might do. I'm not sure, but it's actually my first interview podcast, and so it's very exciting.
great.
Um, I even I even kind of like cue up a little theme song for us to kind of get through this. Well, most of it is because it's kind of hails from the '70s, which is where all of the computing hails from primarily, right? And today I want to talk about open source. So before I do, I want to introduce Bryan. Can I say a few words about you?
Yeah, absolutely.
So Bryan Cantrill is a former distribution engineer at Sun Microsystems, co-inventor of dtrace, right here. Um,
Nice.
which is a kernel level observability framework for Unixes, and in general, I would say is one of the leading minds behind today's computer systems architecture, containerization, bare metal movement, and I would say that your contributions go far beyond just coding the framework and even managing people. I think you're a true visionary. And I think you saw the light of containerization way decades before everyone else did. I was there. So we worked together when I was a CTO at Vanilla. Bryan was CTO at Joint. So we shared some time back then, and really enjoyed talking to Bryan every chance I got. So thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to add anything to that?
No, only that. Thank you so much. I don't know that worthy of all the praise. I feel I was just kind of in the right time, at the right place at the right time a lot of times. But just to say that it was so much fun. Part of what I loved about being in the infrastructure business is your customers are so technically savvy, and I mean, I know you love the conversations with us. We always love the conversations with you because it's so great to be with a customer who is using your stuff to do something else. I mean, as my co-founder, one of my co-founders, Jess Frizzell, is fond of quoting that line from *Halt and Catch Fire* of, we're not the thing, we're the thing that allows people to get to the thing.
Right.
And, always believe that infrastructure needs to be used to do something. So we always really loved those conversations. And actually, just as you're mentioning that, I'm just having the flashback to going down to your offices and getting back out in the street afterwards and being so excited. So
Uh,
it
we,
was
we,
great. It's good times.
I believe we debugged something pretty. I think you found some really, really sneaky bug based on what we were observing, right? Remember that? I can't even remember what it was.
Oh, there were because you were heavy Postgres users, and yeah, we found a couple of really thorny stuff, thorny things.
Well, let's not
But
worry
yeah,
about
it was a lot of
I
fun.
don't want to talk about. I want to talk about that. I want to talk about a little bit of open source because open source
Yeah.
is what we're doing. So I work for FOSSA. FOSSA is basically a company that helps corporations understand what their legal responsibilities are based on complex open source projects, and that's actually turns out to be a relatively hard problem because obviously dependencies have dependencies and so on and so on. It's a multi-level problem, and so you want to kind of answer the question: is my software legal to use by a corporation, or what are the weird obligations that various licenses put on me? And so, in this case, I know you've been a huge proponent of open source from the very beginning, and I, I, I don't know, like, how about you? But I think that I never expected open source to take off this far. Have you? Did you think open source would be this big back 20?
Yeah.
You did.
Yeah, I did, and I'll tell you why. Because just by, I guess, accident of history, the domain that really spoke to me in software engineering was operating systems kernel development. And OS kernel development was one of the first places, maybe the first place, really, other than compilers, to be really disrupted by open source.
Yeah.
And what I had always felt is that people are focusing on the operating system, where open source became table stakes. Became you cannot build a proprietary operating system today. Like that's not something for which there's a market. But that's something that effectively the operating systems were proprietary in the 80s. So we kind of crossed that chasm, and I did really see that going everywhere. I've certainly saw that going to other infrastructure software. I wrote, there's a blog entry I actually wrote, I think in like 2004, which at this point, I guess is a long time ago now. And I've got, now that I'm hiring people that were thankfully alive in 2004, but at some point I'll be hiring people that were not alive in 2004. But talking about the economics of open source and how I saw that coming up stack. It had started at the operating system. It was absolutely going to come to the databases. So I was, not at all surprised to see that happen in the databases. It has happened in effectively all infrastructural software domains.
Yes.
The thing that I would say that I didn't necessarily see coming as clearly, but should have in hindsight, was that open source infrastructure software would allow for service providers to build services more economically than they could have before. And that in turn would allow for a new proprietary software that is service provider software. And that's kind of where we are. I would say that's where we are today. Right now, we are in going through this interesting inflection point where infrastructure software is all de facto open source. Service provider software is all de facto proprietary. And there are now, and that's kind of where the conflict is, right? Where you've got these folks that are, and I'm sure creating a definitely a lot of business opportunity for you in terms of creating these licenses that now have these very strange obligations and covenants on them. It's a real challenge. It's a challenge for the industry because I do think that open source is hugely important. I also think that it's important that everyone realize that because software doesn't wear out and because open source software doesn't get deleted, open source will come for everybody.
Right. It's coming for you.
It is coming for you. I mean, ultimately, in the limit, more and more and more software will be open source. Now, that can take a long time. As Keynes famously said, the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there may be plenty of, there are plenty of great businesses to be built in the interim, but ultimately we can expect effectively all software, certainly more and more software, to become open source.
Yeah, that's great. Do you remember shareware?
Oh, definitely, absolutely. Yeah, I mean for sure. And like you would like send a postcard to someone. They would ask you for a postcard. They would ask you to like buy them a beer. I mean, there was all sorts of things where it's like, did you have any shareware?
I did. I released a birthday reminder. I couldn't remember anyone's birthday, so I wrote one in Visual Basic for Windows, and I kept getting checks for between $5 and $10 from the United States for almost my entire college year.
Wow.
I think I got close to $1,000 total in checks.
Okay, so that's the difference between you and me. I also had shareware. It was a menu program that allowed you to easily have menus from DOS batch files.
Ooh, nice. Which I used a lot.
Right, exactly. I felt like it was really useful. Turbo Pascal, not Visual Basic, but I feel like very similar vintage.
Yep.
I sold one copy of that for $5. Peter Rubenstein, wherever you are, I have not forgotten you, and thank you for your $5 charity.
If I put that $5 in the Bitcoin in 2010.
No, exactly. So that would have been 1990 or 1991. And Peter Rubenstein was really just like a friend of mine that used computers. He's like, yeah, this is useful. I'll give you $5 for this. So I was like, all right, cool.
That's awesome.
But that was it. I didn't really, you didn't really have the means. I didn't really have the means of distribution. A BBS was the way you would distribute that kind of thing.
I discovered the Usenet back then, and that's what made it possible to kind of announce things.
Right, and so I came online. I actually saw a great tweet this morning that it is the 10,000th day of September 1993. And I'm like, man, I'm not even sure people are going to get that reference, but that's the Eternal September, right? The Eternal September was September 1993, where it used to be that people could only be on the internet when they went to college. And I'm literally the last generation to do that. I went to college in September of 1992, University in September 1992. So I had only been on BBSs, and then like you get dropped onto like FTP sites, and you're like,
Right.
what is this? I'm in like Woo Archive downloading EGA games. Like I'm just like on a coke bender of EGA games. This is just like I am loving life, discovering the internet. But that eternal September, where they could no longer see that cycle of students arriving on campuses in September, was in September of 1993, where enough internet usage became available at home that people had the internet. But I didn't have the internet in high school, but had it in university.
I never heard about this. So what happened? People didn't show up to school?
No, it's not that. It's just that. So the kind of the Usenet lore was every September, this new batch of idiots would arrive on the internet, namely college freshmen.
Gotcha.
And there would be this like extended period of idiocy on Usenet while
Every step.
I mean, you remember like netiquette, like a term that has totally fallen out of usage. This is where we sound like fogies down at the home. But they didn't know their netiquette. They didn't know, how the internet worked. And then they would learn it by like November or whatever. And so September of 1993 is called the Eternal September because the new users were coming now every month. It wasn't just September.
Oh,
and the internet was now exploding in growth. People were getting it at home, and netiquette was lost, basically. It's basically the collapse of civilization because, the hoi polloi, the masses now were directly connected to the internet, for which you can draw a straight line to the real Donald Trump Twitter account and the absolute collapse of humanity. So there you go. Eternal September, 10,000th day of Eternal September.
Let's call that little Mayan civilization because
totally.
it was still back there. I actually distributed my shareware through the Usenet, and it was the first time that I included the little clause, the copyright clause and whatnot, and sent. And it had my PO box, and it had my name, and it's like, you like this? Please send me a check, and. Turns out that a lot of people wanted to know when their friends' birthdays were. I actually had some pretty advanced features that you could have a warning configured per person. So like for your mom, you could have like a week prior to your mom's birthday, you could have a warning come up, So it was pretty, not bad for its time. Yeah.
That is great. Oh my God, that's great. I think it's terrific. And it's funny because like shareware, what a concept that has just been totally.
And why did it go away? And why did it I think shareware kind of gave birth to old open source software in a way. But I'm a little sad that it went away. Like it's it's not a bad idea. I guess
it is not a bad idea, and it's kind of interesting, and it's especially that's interesting that you made $1,000. I definitely I had no means of promoting this thing. I'm basically the only person that saw this program gave me $5 for it. So it's actually totally reasonable to think that if I had gotten it more broadly out there, that it would have been. And also, honestly, it was a different zeitgeist around software too, where it's like, I didn't go into software to make a killing. Like I got into software because I enjoyed it. It was fun. It was neat. It was solving problems, building useful things.
Yeah.
And so the idea of being like not getting kind of up into the right outsized VC rewards for what you're doing, but just like some money that you could spend on, beer as a student or whatever.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah. And honestly, I think you and I have a very similar timeline. I went to college in 91 in Ukraine, and then I immigrated to Australia. So I landed in Monash University, Melbourne in 2092 as well.
There you go. Right. Totally.
And
yeah.
In a computer lab there, I sent my first email to my uncle in Israel. And I received a response within 35 seconds. And it blew my mind. Like at that point, I was still sending little paper letters to my lady in Ukraine, and it took a month to go there and back. So a month is what I was sort of used to. And suddenly it was a 35-second response. That was my aha moment. What was yours? When did you have an aha moment about what the hell is now possible, given that everything is connected via wire? Did you that?
EGA games from Woo Archive. I feel like I feel like yours is so much more profound than mine is. I want to reflect on yours for a lot longer because I think that so that's in 1991.
Yeah.
So the wall comes down in '89. I think people do not. I mean, you're growing up. I mean, in the former Soviet Union, right? I mean, it's like
Right.
I mean, the world has changed so much in those 2 years.
Oh yeah.
And there was you think about people had been separated from their relatives for such an extended period of time. Certainly I'm thinking about Berlin, and to go from like that to modernity with the 35-second response time from the uncle in
Right.
Israel. I mean, that's got to be like brain melting down.
It
I mean,
was. It was a VMX system, by the way.
nice,
And
nice.
whenever VAX receives an email, it spits it out across your terminal. No matter what you're doing, it just writes the entire contents of an email across all of your whatever characters you have on your terminal. So it becomes completely garbled, and you have to like figure out which characters are the email and which characters were there before. It was so funny.
Well, and so and there's so my aha moment. I mean, it is pathetic, but my aha moment was like, oh my god, I'm on the world's biggest BBS with no upload and download ratios. If you remember those, right?
Right.
You had
Yeah.
like and you're not. I mean, I remember being like, where are the phone lines? Like, I don't understand how this is like. This is glorious, and I don't want to like interrupt this dream by asking how it works. But
Right.
how does it work? How am I sitting down at this workstation and I can FTP like as
Stop.
much as I want? I am, it's like there's nobody. I don't understand how this is working. And I remember thinking, and the other like big aha moment that was happening concurrently with me was the ability. I had pulled up 4x terms, and I had 1x term like FTPing EGA games from Woo Archive.
Mhm.
I had another X term with like an editor up, another X term with like where I was a shell and I was compiling things, and the idea that I was running these totally different things, but sharing a single CPU, because DOS and Windows had basically robbed me of my childhood. I didn't
Right.
really like understand that was like, I knew kind of intellectually that was technically possible, but that was so the aha moment was not just around the connectivity, but around how you could actually turn the computer into something that was much more useful
Yeah.
by having much smarter software. I came to appreciate that it's like, actually, this is just using technology that has existed for your entire childhood, Bryan, and actually Bill Gates robbed you of it, and set me on a multi-decade vendetta, because I feel that people accepted such unreliable computing for so long. It's a hard era to remember.
Yeah. No, it's true. Yeah. And at the time, and what's ironic is, I was also a huge Linux fan, and I installed Linux pre one version one, off something like 60 floppy disks
Right? Yeah.
on my computer. I had a 14.4K modem line, and I ran a website for Russian-speaking community of Melbourne. Now get this, okay? This is going to tickle you. In 1995, I received a letter inviting me to a black tie ceremony that Telstra was organizing. It was 1995 Australian Internet Awards. It was literally like Grammys. It was just like Grammy. It was like the tables with people, everyone
Oh my
wearing
gosh.
boxes. And the first category that they announce is the community side category. And then they read 5 contendants, and we are one of those 5. Me, I'm there with my friend Vitaly, who was my co-founder. And the site is running off my 14.4K modem at my house. And it was like think of it as kind of like a static version of Craigslist for Russians.
Right. Yeah. Wow. That is amazing.
And the first winner they announced is us. And we were just like, what is going on? And my friend Vitaly was a little tipsy by the time. So we go up there to the stage, and he accepts the awards. He grabs the microphone and he yells, "Russians are coming!"
Oh my God,
and I still have that trophy from 1995.
Oh, that is great.
It's a crystal globe with dub over it.
I feel like we're so lucky, to have been just like such a witness to history.
Yes.
To have seen that explosion. Because I think the other thing is like, it was hard for us at the time to discern, at least hard for me to discern, what is happening technologically versus what am I merely discovering because I'm at the age where you're kind of discovering these things.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I think it took me a while to really fully appreciate that. Like, no, I kind of coming along at a time when it was actually exploding. It wasn't merely that I was discovering this new world. The new world was becoming much larger at that moment, basically. Which it made it was exciting. It was it was, and it's funny to think about, like, what from there. And you think like that's only like 8 years prior to the dot-com crash, right? We go from like this quick
Right.
cycle. I
Right.
just
Yes.
anyway.
Yeah. No, it was. But the irony of this whole thing is that being a Linux fan, I read the Linux administration book. That's how I learned Unix. It clicked immediately. Like the whole pipe thing was just. I was like, oh my god, this is the way. Glory.
This is the way.
This is
Yeah.
the way. But at the same time, I was still doing mathematics, and what turned me into a decision to give up mathematics career entirely was an article in Playboy about Bill Gates.
Oh wow, that's
Can you
funny.
believe that? Yeah, it's actually a really good article. It still exists online. I've read it recently, and it's a very thoughtful article that talks about future computing. And I was like, this is it. I have to do this. And that's how I ended up here. So
That's
I don't,
great.
I don't want to talk about myself too much. I want to talk a little bit about software licensing. And
Yeah, definitely.
tell me the weirdest license you've seen, or like,
Well, so
do you have
first of all,
or anecdote about like something that like you like an open source license that blew your
well,
mind?
so first of all, you are with the shareware. You're really evoking. That's evoking a different era. And there were a bunch. There was like, everyone was kind of doing what they wanted, and there were some super weird ones.
Oh yeah,
It's like people look at like the Perl artistic license, and you're like, no, like that was like the mainstream license compared to like and you had people doing all sorts of nutty things. The you know, that obviously the GPL was, I think, very important for kind of mainstreaming um, the and it's kind of interesting. Like you kind of take it apart of like what are those kind of pivotal moments. Linux is clearly one. I think Perl is one. I think Perl is one where the reason I say that is because Perl is one of the early open source things I think you can point to where the open source artifact was better than what you could get in a
yeah,
proprietary form factor.
right.
Where I don't know what even the proprietary analog for Perl would be, but there was, and I think Apache was the other one where you had the early web servers were all open source. So it's like the best web servers were basically open source. So that is kind of where some of the open source begins to get its real traction in terms of like the licenses. I feel like we've gone through these like various oscillations. Clearly, in this kind of pre-Cambrian shareware era, it's everyone just doing whatever the hell they want, and it's postcardware and beerware and all this other shit. Then you hit, I think, this era of the kind of the dominance of the GPL, which I would say maybe starts certainly with GCC and with Linux. Obviously, Linux is a major component of the dominance of the GPL. I think by the time you are in the early 2000s, it's GPL or bust, basically. They're like, I know when we at Sun, when we open sourced Solaris, it was, and I know this is an issue, like people get very frothy about this online, and it probably will always remain frothy about this. But the GPL was really not an option for us because we wanted to explicitly allow proprietary software to sit alongside open source software in the same address space.
Right.
And that was issue one. Issue two was we explicitly wanted to grant patents to people using the code. And the GPL just says nothing about patents. And the which is a problem because and there's reasons for the GPL and its patent disposition, but software patents do exist, and it is important that we are upfront about that. And you want to be sure that when I'm using your open source software, I am not actually embedding a claim that you can have against me that I'm using your patent.
Right.
So
I actually wasn't aware of any connection between patents and license. How are they connected in that way?
Oh, so well, no, I mean, it's a very important connection because I think certainly one of the concerns always has been, we haven't seen this happen. I think it's been more of a fear than a reality, but somebody has a patent on something, has a software patent. They take an embodiment of that and upstream it into a largely distributed software program and then litigate on that some period of time later. So, you could imagine,
So it was like a sort of a patent troll of the day.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Gotcha. And, there are always like a bunch of things going on. And, one of the things going on was that William Rehnquist, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, didn't want to hear any patent cases. So there was a really extended period of time where the Supreme Court took 0 patent cases. Mm-hmm. And so patent law from a Supreme Court perspective was kind of frozen in time at a time that predated software. And that was really problematic. And so you remember the NTP versus BlackBerry case. I mean, there were some major software patent cases. And certainly there was an era where, people were incentivized to get software patents. These very broad patents are being given. There's what's called the obvious test in a patent. And I had always inferred that just as like an engineer, not as a lawyer. But the obvious test always to me was that obvious to you at the time, you as an engineer? And my metric that I always gave for engineers, because engineers would ask like, hey, like this thing that we did, is that patentable or not? And here is my really easy test. Do you remember where you were when you came up with the idea? And if you remember, and if you can describe to me, the day and where you were physically, it's like if you remember that, then you know what? That idea is not obvious. Like when that idea clicked for you, there was some part of your brain that is like, holy shit, mark the day and time. Like this is a big deal.
Right.
If you don't remember where you were, it's like, I don't know, I just like came to work and did it. It's like, you know what? It probably wasn't, it may be subtle, it may be important, but it is at some level, it is like just like doing your job. And
you read something, then maybe a little days later it clicked or something like that, right?
Right. And so that to me was the test, but that was not the test. The test had been inferred to be, is this obvious to some random person off the street? It's like, well, if you're, I mean, as we've seen recently, like random people off the street definitely don't have the highest standards for understanding. And, there's lots of stuff that's not obvious, and there are lots of domains of expertise, and there are lots of things that, for us as domain experts in software, things in other domains that wouldn't be obvious to us, that would be obvious to someone in that domain. So, but that was the standard for a long time. And, God bless the John Roberts Court for taking on very important patent cases that had 9-0 Supreme Court decisions, which I love. We always love to talk about the 5-4 Supreme Court decisions, which are important and often are important social issues. But to me, like the 9-0 decisions are almost more interesting because like you have something like, look, the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Clarence Thomas agreed on something. Like that's probably like just the truth. Whatever it is they agreed on, it's like we can. And so there were these really important, there's the eBay case, KSR Teleflex case, where they took these 9-0 decisions that really changed the way we view what is patentable. And they clarified that, like, no, the obvious test actually is like, it is obvious to your doppelganger. It's not obvious to someone who's not, it's obvious to someone that is, quote, skilled in the art. And if it's obvious to someone that's skilled in the art, then it's not patentable. And that really, I think, changed the instructions to the patent office. It changed what was patentable. And it made this kind of, so this menace, I feel, which probably hit its apex with either the NTP versus, and not Network Time Protocol, but NTP, the patent troll versus BlackBerry, or the SCO case, another kind of high profile case. But it kind of hit. And remember Grok Law? Grok Law was so good.
I
You remember that?
No, I don't remember that. I remember SCO. SCO was against Linux, right?
Yeah, the SCO case was against Linux, and this was SCO, the Santa Cruz operation, had become the company itself had more or less capsized, old proprietary Unix, and was litigating against Linux. I guess it was litigating against, I don't know who the defendant was, like maybe the Linux Foundation. But they had a bunch of claims that were all ultimately discarded. It was ultimately kind of, I think, a waste of time and energy. But I would say that like those were that's kind of the apex of the patent menace in software patents, I would say. Yeah. I'm sure there's someone listening to this who's vehemently disagreeing with that, probably for good reason. But since then, I would say that with the test being the test for patents being much higher, and also like open source being much more ubiquitous, patents being, I think, just kind of less important as a tool for protecting intellectual property, you've seen that go down. But the patent grant or the absence of a patent grant is really important. So when you look at a license, you should look about what it says around patent grants. And one of the grand ironies is that there is this kind of FUD around ZFS because, quote unquote, Oracle owns ZFS. It's like, well, you should look at the ZFS is actually licensed under a license that gives you the in perpetuity rights to the patents that cover ZFS. If ZFS were under the GPL, you would have been afforded no such license. And the grand irony is that you would actually be at greater risk from Oracle, which a clearly bad actor. I mean, the Java case shows that they are. There is no hesitation on Oracle's part to litigate. And so the fact that they can't because of that patent license that's granted to the Cuddle is actually very important. The Cuddle is the common development distribution license that we used for Solaris. It was basically an MPL derivative. It was a cleaned up MPL, the Mozilla Public License. I really like the MPL. I think the MPL is great. They did an MPL 2.0, which I really like a lot. The Apache Public License is also APL 2.0 is important. But both of those licenses.
What about MIT? What about MIT license?
So MIT, I like. The problem with MIT is it doesn't say anything about patents, but other than that, I mean, I get uncomfortable with licenses that are restricting how you use software. That to me is where I get really, really fidgety, and for a bunch of reasons. One, and so I don't like the GPL for this reason. The GPL has this restriction on derived works, and nobody knows what a derived work is in software. I mean, we don't have a clear definition of a derived work. And, there is a school of thought that says that if you are running a program in Linux, it is a derived work of Linux. Now, clearly, I think not many people would agree with that. Yeah. But how about a device driver? It's like, well, device driver gets a lot murkier, right? Is a derived work, is a device driver a derived work or not? It's like, where is this boundary for a derived work? That gets murky. I don't like the fact that the GPL has that restriction. And, that's when I would say the focus on the GPL and the GP was really on this preventing you from having derived works. And this is just something that I believe more abstractly, I would say, is how do you get people to do things, right? And and you'll appreciate this, having spent some time in Australia. So my late father-in-law was a professor of accounting, and in Australia, my wife grew up in Australia. He was at the University of Wollongong, and one of the things that he observed as his American son-in-law I was responsible personally for everything wrong with America. I invented all of America and was responsible for so anytime we had kind of an axe to grind with America, like I was the one that got to hear it. But and which led to plenty of conversations of like, no, I agree with you. But one of the things that was interesting is around accounting in particular. So Australia has what is called principles-based accounting.
Okay.
And where you've got the guiding principles, but the actual details are left to you, the accountant, but you need to abide by the principles.
Mm-hmm.
America has what's called rules-based accounting, where there are no guiding principles, there's just a bunch of rules. Well,
Right.
One of the implications of that is like, well, if you're going to give me a bunch of rules, then finding creative ways around the rules is not wrong. That's just creative.
Right.
Like that's good. That's not bad. That's good because
fine line though. It could be a fine line.
Well, no, but it's not a fine line. If I'm not, no, because the line is the rules. If I'm not breaking the rules, I'm not doing anything wrong.
Right. If you're not breaking the rules, yeah,
I'm not breaking the rules. And so this is what gives rise to what we call creative accounting, where people do things that are not illegal. They're not breaking the rules, but they are not abiding by the underlying spirit of accurately representing your accounts. Right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And in Australia, or a place with principles-based accounting, you can't do that because you can't evade the principles.
That's so interesting. I had no idea about this. Are there any other countries like Australia that do that?
It's certainly not. I mean, it's my understanding. Unfortunately, my father-in-law has passed away. I'm sure he would be, from the grave. I'm sure he would be berating me for getting this wrong. But I believe it's much of the British common law. I believe that like
common
the UK
law
is also principles based. I think America is more of an outlier in being rules based, but and it is. I think it's like really interesting. So it's like gets to like and as a parent of teenagers, I also appreciate this. It's like, do you want to be rules based or do you want to be principles based?
Yeah.
And as much as possible, I think you want to be principles based about things.
Can you give an example of like the difference or like?
So
maybe in the context of
well, so I mean, in terms of like the difference is that I can tell you like a difference right now is as a teenager during the time of COVID,
mm-hmm.
the rule is that you need to wear your mask whenever you're outside of the house.
Right.
But actually, the principle is that we need to not get coronavirus, and we need to understand just because you can get coronavirus because you're wearing your mask, right? And so like one of the things that certainly with my 16-year-old, who bless him has been so far very understanding and very conscientious, but like it's not enough to wear your mask. If you're around somebody who is not masked, for example, and is contagious, you can absolutely get coronavirus. So it's like I'm not going to give you all of the rules about who needs to be how many feet away and everything else. I need you to use your brain,
right.
And you need to assess a situation, and you need to determine is this safe or not. You need to use your judgment, and the overriding principle is we can't get coronavirus. Like we need to.
All right. So principle based, I guess whatever means that you're sort of using the underlying principle to make a decision in the right direction versus following blindly a sort of rule set by someone else.
Right. And so to get this back to kind of open source, to me, the principle should be there's a social contract here, not a legal contract, but a social contract that if you use this software and it's valuable to you, instead of sending Konstantin $5, which is what you would have done in the early 90s,
mm-hmm.
we want, and if you find a bug, contribute that bug back. That is the principle. The principle is that you have a social contract and a moral obligation to assist the thing that assisted you.
Right. So if you're using
but open source licenses have become very rules based.
Yes.
And they've tried to become rules based. So I'm like, no, like I'm going to find all the loopholes, and I'm going to prevent you from, like, I am trying to prevent AWS from standing up a database service that's going to compete with me. So I'm going to put all these like stupid ass riders in this license to try to prevent that. And I'm like, and I'm sure you, and boy, everybody of our vintage, I feel like it's like, hey, millennials and Gen Zers, Gen X is trying to tell you something. And if you could stop relicensing your software for a second and listen, what you're doing is not going to work. Because we came up in the era of proprietary software. We watched open source software take over the world. And if you think that Confluent are going to prevent AWS from using Kafka with a license, you're out of your mind. And in fact, you are making a huge mistake, because instead of getting an ally, like if you're Kafka, not Confluent, but Kafka, the software, and AWS is using your software, that's great.
Totally.
Like, and if you can't turn that energy into something that contributes back to your software, that is ultimately on you. Now, AWS has historically been a bad actor in this regard. And one of the things that I and others have taken them to task with is, you are using the software and you are not contributing back. You are violating that social contract. But when the Confluence of the world turn around and try to be very rules based with the way they license it, it's like, well, you know what? We Gen Xers throw up our hands. It's like, you know what? We tried to help you out, but you're screwing yourselves, because now you have rightfully turned AWS into an adversary. And that's stupid, because AWS has got lots of technical talent, has got effectively infinite resources, and you are not going to prevent them from doing something. And in fact, what you're going to do is you're going to incentivize them to find ways where they are abiding by your rules and not actually abiding by the broader social contract. So congratulations on screwing yourselves.
Right. And I think part of this lies in the fact that 20, even 30, like 30 years ago, I think there were so few people writing free software. And I think it was reasonable to worry about, someone else making money on your free software. But now, there's millions upon millions of open source developers. And today, the problem is not about necessarily even writing it or even licensing it, but it's to get people to use it. There's so much great software written that no one uses, right? And it's a sea of I think it's a Poisson distribution with like a maybe tiny 3% of open source projects that are getting most of the the 95% of the usage, and then the rest is just a giant tail end. And so putting any sort of restrictions prevents it even further. Like, why would you do that? I think
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I can tell you that we, like a lot of companies, have an allergic reaction to those restrictions. Because, I'll tell you the time, and I'm sure you found this to be true, but the time at which that licensing most matters is especially when you're going to have a partnership or an acquisition by another company. That is when, you're a startup, you're using whatever. Now a larger company wants to acquire you. Well, now it's time to figure out what exactly and like, they're going to care a lot about that, because you're a startup. Like, we don't have deep pockets. Who's going to sue us? But large company, deep pockets, and much bigger target. They're going to care a lot more. And that's where people do pay attention to this stuff. And when it was funny, we were at a company that was bought by a much larger company, and we're doing the licensing audit. And, we had kind of paid attention to it, but like kind of not paid attention to it. So like, we do go to this licensing audit, and you're just like, God, what is this going to find? Fortunately, so much of what we had built there had been Node.js based. And whether in Node.js, boy, cutting and pasting is certainly people just kind of cut and paste a lot. And boy, do they cut and paste the license a lot. It was basically all MIT. We had no GPL in any of our NPM ecosystem, which was kind of stunning, because we're pulling in dependencies of dependencies of dependencies and not really auditing them. So
Well,
we knew
that's really what FOSSA does, right? Like, so FOSSA will analyze a project, and it'll go all the way down to all the level of dependencies, and it'll even go to the source file level and look at all the copyrights. Which brings me to another question about copyright.
yeah.
How does copyright and all rights reserved, on a file, does that even is it even compatible with an open source license? How does it work?
It's funny because in the position of this, I feel has like changed every year, because it used to be that you needed this big block, supposedly.
Mm-hmm.
And then that block also had to have, and like I think the lawyers change their mind on this every year. So like it used to be that block had to have the first year that it was written, and it had to go up to the year of the most recent modification. And then you needed to have the C symbol to indicate that it was copyrighted, and then you need to say all rights reserved, and then you need to say proprietary and confidential. You need to say this, and that block got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. There used to be like this big annual tradition where it's like, okay, it's New Year's now.
Go change all the years.
Oh, you got to change all the years, right? And that has I know that different lawyers think different things on this. I still believe that I like to put the copyright up there. I like to have all rights reserved because we're not giving up copyright, and I would prefer to have that as part of a reminder to somebody that if you do happen to find this file separated from its larger vessel,
Right.
that you got some indicator of where this thing came from. I don't think legally it matters very much. Certainly, it is Google's position that it doesn't. I believe, I don't speak for Google, but there are large open source creators who believe that it means nothing, and that there is no reason to have anything at the top of the file, and the license file dictates all. I think a lot of this stuff has not been litigated, so it's hard to know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it all comes down to, like, if I find my file in someone else's project with all the copyright removed, what can I do about it? And,
that's right.
And I'm guessing the answer is probably not much.
Yeah, and I think it depends. I mean, obviously, we're still waiting for kind of the last chapter in Oracle v. Google, which will have,
Is that
who
the
knows
Java?
how that
Is
will
that the Java?
happen. Yeah, this is the Java thing. Who knows how that's going to come down.
Yeah.
Certainly you can paint a very dire picture where that has a very serious, profound, adverse impact on all of software if you were to have a very broad decision. I feel that's unlikely, but who knows? But yeah, I mean, I think that is kind of the question of like, what does it mean? And, who's actively going to litigate it? I mean, you do need to be able to show damages is the other thing. I mean,
right. And that's what warranty is, right? Like the warranty disclosure.
That's right. Well, and the warranty disclosure is also interesting because that was another like total fear, is that software was going to be used in a way that would have loss of property or loss of life, and they would go like, hey, like we root cause this, and it's because of your shareware that we pulled in this birthday reminder.
Right.
It malfunctioned, and so the car, our self-driving car, crashed into a phone pole because the birthday reminder malfunctioned. It's not clear to me. I'd be interested to know. I don't think there's a whole lot of case law around that. It's kind of a crazy, one thing that software engineers have a hard time with the law, because we want to view it like software, like right or wrong. It like either works or crashes. And it's like, yeah, that's not the legal system. One, has got ambiguity everywhere. Two, the legal system is ultimately an economic system. The act of litigation is an economic act. It costs money. And so, kind of like anyone can sue anyone else at any time. It's just that it costs them money to do so, and it's unlikely to go anywhere. So it is so I think that we often like to think like, oh, this prevents you from being sued, or this, it's like, no, it doesn't. It throws up an additional speed bump. maybe.
So you really think that if I open sourced something, let's say under MIT license, and someone used it and let's say it caused the data corruption, that they can go
No,
after you? I don't think so.
no, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think it would be. I think it would be very, very, very expensive to do so. I think that you would have a bunch of pretty straightforward defenses,
Right.
and I said so. I think not only would it be very expensive to do so, I think it's unlikely to have results. Also, like if you know, the, and this is where the Oracle v. Google is a bit of an anomaly, where you have one deep-pocketed malicious company
Hmm.
going after another very deep pocketed company. So that's where you really get Clash of the Titans, and where cooler heads don't prevail, and you can have this protracted litigation. I think most people realize in business, litigation is a terrible business strategy. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just like it is really unlikely to yield anything. And then I think that litigation almost always has some anterior motive. I think in Oracle's case, their interior motive, their ulterior motive is we are going to prevail in this case, and then we are going to extract license fees from the world. Like we're not actually
Right.
like Google is actually not the prize for them. The prize is humanity. That's what they actually want to go conquer,
As
and
you
they want to go conquer humanity by extracting onerous licensing fees on anyone touching any open source Java, which of course it won't work.
tell me one thing. So what? I don't know. We might be running close to time. Tell me if you have to cut short. But one of the things that was really fascinating to me always is the fate of MySQL. You know,
Yes. Yeah.
MySQL was really big back in 2000s, and I when I did I had to pick a database back in 2004, and to me the fact that MySQL swallowed all the constraints without actually enforcing them was a non-starter. But to a lot of people, you know, who were looking for performance, like Twitter, MySQL was the kind of only option at that point in time. But you know, with Oracle's buying Sun and Sun buying MySQL, um, that whole momentum disappeared. What happened?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there are a couple things that happened that, as far as I can tell, one is that Postgres didn't have replication, which was I mean, remember that like extended period of like 5 years where Postgres did not have replication as a point of principle, like classic Postgres. I mean, I mean, I'm sure you feel the same like complicated relationship with Postgres. Like there are things I absolutely love about Postgres, and there are things that drive me bananas about Postgres. And one of the things that the Postgres to me is one of those classic examples of, you know, when someone says it's technically impossible, it often means like I don't feel like doing it.
Yeah.
And replication was technically impossible for a long period of time. And and also Postgres can sometimes let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So there was this protracted period where if you wanted replication out of an open source database, it was MySQL. It was like
Right.
Postgres was just not available. I think that now one thing that'd be interesting is like, boy, did the introduction of replication, was that hastened by the Oracle acquisition of Sun? And it might have been. I mean, I think that's not an unreasonable inference. At the same time, we started getting NoSQL databases, and that's where you start getting Mongo, and then I mean, not, you know, at some point, the internet being that MongoDB being web scale is going to be forgotten by humanity, and this is going to be. But you and I both, I'm sure you remember where you were when you saw that, the MongoDB.
I went to 3 MongoDB conferences, not because I used Mongo, but because I was laughing inside. But you know, it was I think in the third conference that I discovered that not only MongoDB had a global per database write lock, but that they were celebrating moving it into a collection level lock. So it was now at a table level. And that was a big celebrated thing. It was like incoming from Postgres world, you know, you're like, wait, you guys don't do row level locking? No, that's not possible. That's not technically possible. Yeah.
It's not technically possible. It's exactly.
No, but I think MySQL, from what I've been observing, MySQL I think got exploded in around 2003-4 because they distributed a one-click Windows installer,
Yeah, interesting.
and
Yeah,
Postgres didn't.
yeah.
And so it was trivial to get MySQL running on Windows, and it was really not trivial to get Postgres running. But once the whole acquisition happened, my understanding is that a lot of the open source momentum left MySQL, and the same people who were previously working there, like, started working on Postgres. What did acquisition by Oracle, I guess, do from licensing perspective? Did it change anything about MySQL that somehow pushed these developers away, or am I reading it wrong?
Well, I think that you've got any body of software in the hands of a litigious bad actor like Oracle has got to make you nervous. I mean, it's like you look. I mean, again, it's like I think that has been an impediment to ZFS adoption, has been Oracle's ownership of ZFS,
Mhm.
even though that's under a license whereby Oracle can't exert that ownership in any meaningful capacity.
It still prevents people from
It
adopting.
still prevents people. So I think there, and then I mean, this is where you get to kind of principles versus rules. But like when something that that is in the hands of a bad actor, even if it's well constructed, makes people more nervous than something that is poorly constructed, but in the hands of someone who of an entity that's thought to be benevolent.
Yeah.
And so I think that the perception, and it wasn't just the perception. I mean, in remarkably short order, and as someone who's inside of Oracle watching them do this, it was so disgusting to watch them go through project after project. I mean, it's like, do people know that Jenkins used to be Hudson? I mean, it's like, remember that? Like Jenkins was Hudson.
Yeah.
And Hudson was every bit as popular as Jenkins became because it was the same thing. And Oracle decided to renationalize Hudson, and in particular the name. And they couldn't use the name for the open source project. And the open source project, to their credit, flipped Oracle the bird and changed the name to Jenkins, and people pretty much forgot the name Hudson and moved on.
Right.
But you look at, down the line, Oracle went to these social contracts and ripped them up. I mean, they reproprietarized Open Solaris, which is disgusting. They, and then the litigation. I think, the litigation.
Can you even do that? Or can you do this? Can you
No.
You can't.
No. Well, two things. One, no. All you can do is create a proprietary fork. So it's like you, Oracle, haven't actually reproprietarized Open Solaris. You've created a proprietary only fork of Solaris, which sadly, then there was, there's an additional 7 years of development, 8 years that was done on that by people. If they were not actually ex-Sun, they were certainly Sun culturally. There was a Sun culture alive inside of the belly of the beast. In the belly of the beast, the Sun culture was alive and working on that system, and those contributions were never able to make it outside, and they were never able to benefit from the contributions that were done outside. And it's just the whole thing's gross. And that all happened because of copyright assignment.
Mhm.
So if people had not assigned copyright to, at the time, Sun, then later became Oracle, that they wouldn't have been able to do that. So one thing that I do think people need to treat seriously is copyright assignment in an open source project. And how do you think of copyright assignment? I personally prefer contributors to maintain their own copyright because it makes relicensing impossible, but it also makes relicensing impossible, right? So, I mean, it means that you are basically locked in to the terms under which the contributor contributed to the project can't change after that contribution. And I think that's probably a good thing.
So what you're suggesting then on an open source project is to have, some sort of a license, like let's say MIT, Apache, whatnot, but then also in a file put a copyright with, the list of contributors as a designation there, and that is not necessarily perpendicular in any way to the license itself. It still allows people to use it however they want, but what does it prevent I guess.
What it prevents is it prevents that project later deciding they want to relicense. So
Someone
if
else, some other entity deciding to relicense it,
or just the project itself. So and there have been projects that did this. So VLC, um, the video codec,
the video.
video library, um, relicensed. So it was, if I'm remembering correctly, it was LGPL, and they relicensed, I believe, to MIT. There's a great talk by the kind of the leader of the VLC project, one of the leaders of the VLC project, from this would be from Fisley in 2012, where he, if I'm recalling correctly, talks about tracking down each of these contributors. And because this is what you have to go do, is like, if you're not going to assign copyright, you've got to go find each of these people and get them to agree to this relicensing. If you have, I mean, this is just the way humanity works, sadly. If you have any non-trivial number of contributors for any non-trivial amount of time, one of those contributors can't be found at all.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And one of those contributors, at least, is dead.
Oh.
And the dead contributors are a real problem, because now you're going back to a widow or to a surviving child, and you are saying, hey, look, your mom did, or your wife or your spouse or your husband did this contribution to our library, and we need you to sign this document to allow us to relicense it. The odds of that person understanding open source software and being like, yeah, I totally understand why you're licensing this. Here's my John Hancock. Have a great day, is zero. Right. What you are going to have is like, well, wait a minute. We're not going to sign this without talking to a lawyer. And, here we are, out in the country. This lawyer has never seen software before. And it's like, well, wait a minute. If these fancy pants, big city software people want to relicense your software, they should pay you for it. And you have to be like, no, look, like, we're not going to pay you for it. Like, our offer is $0.00. That's our offer, and that's our last, best, and final. Sign this, or we're going to rewrite it. Like, that's what is the actual subtext there. Right. But you've got someone who is grieving the loss of a loved one. Like, that's not something they want to hear, and you're in a mess.
It's alternative. Like, how do you avoid that? Do you just put
so you avoid that, but one of two ways. One, you avoid that by getting copyright assignment. So when you contribute to this project, you assign copyright to me. And because you've assigned copyright to me, if I want to later change from the LGPL to the GPL, or the GPL2 to the GPL3, I have copyright, I can change it.
And is that license? Like I guess.
Yeah, no, that's
how does it work? Like, is that part of the licensing of the project that the
there is if you are going to assign copyright in a project, there is a separate procedure you go through to assign that copyright. And there's a document that you will have that you will submit as part of contributing to the project that will assign copyright. That is becoming less and less frequent, thankfully. So Sun did this. That's what Sun did with open source. That's why Oracle was able to effectively take these open source contributions and relicense them and make them proprietary. The other approach, which to me is like just the more pragmatic approach, is, yeah, we're not changing the license. This is like, yeah, you're going to contribute to this thing. You're going to hold copyright on it. You're going to die. And we are going to continue to be under the same license. And we're not going to have a reason to, we honor your contribution, honor your life, and have nothing but sympathy for your loved ones. But we are not going to come back to your grieving family and attempt them to get them to relicense the software that you contributed.
So let's look at a simple example. Let's say I have a popular open source component, and someone submits a pull request, and they add a new source file, and they plop a copyright at the top, which has their name,
right?
Not my name. And every other file in the project has my copyright on it. What is that the right way to kind of go about this, or what would you suggest there?
So, I mean, there are different ways of doing it, and I think every project needs to figure out what's going to work for them. And different projects do different things, probably based on their history. One thing that a lot of projects do that is a very reasonable thing to do is this is going to be copyright Konstantin and contributors. where you've got the header of the file or copyright. What was the name of your birthday reminder, by the way? What was the I gotta get what was the thing actually called? The birthday reminder shareware app.
Oh, I think it was called Birthday Reminder.
Oh God, the 80s, the 90s were such a great time. It's like, hey, it's the first birthday reminder program. So this one's just called Birthday Reminder. All right. So copyright birthday reminder contributors.
Right.
And then there is a contributors file that exists in the root directory that has all the contributors.
Hmm.
To me, that's a very reasonable thing to do. It's also reasonable. I think it's fine to have people add I think because people want to have the halo effect and the kind of the positive reinforcement that comes from contributing to a project. It's not
Right.
unreasonable to add their copyright line. That does get into problems of like, okay, so what if I do some work and I remove code from this file? Have I changed that file or not?
Right.
And so there are some murky areas here. If I enforce a new style rule in the repository and I've got a change that touches 1,000 files, am I now adding my copyright header to 1,000 files? And does that feel like the right thing to do?
Yeah.
And I think it's one of these things where like you need to get to the underlying issue. It's like the underlying issue probably is around attribution and association. You probably have someone who's like, hey, like I want to be recognized for
Want
this.
to
Like
list
I
this
made a
contributor, right?
contribution, and how can we find a way of recognizing you in a way that's consistent with the project? Is
Right.
probably the best path. But I do think projects need to figure this out. I mean, and every project needs to have some idea of how we're going to consider copyright. I think if people are considering a license, I really do steer people towards either the Apache Public License 2.0 or the MPL 2.0. I like the MPL 2.0. It's a file-based copyleft, which it's got kind of a rule to it and a principle. It's a little bit of both. But I do think you need to be careful. Not careful is too strong a word. I think it's in your best interest as a project to have a license that is modern and reflects some of the modern thinking. So in particular, when you have a project that is under the APL 2.0, anyone making a contribution to that and MPL 2.0 has an implicit or explicit warrant that it's their own work. So if you contribute something to, I contribute something to Birthday Reminder, and then as it turns out, like I actually didn't own the software that I contributed to Birthday Reminder. It was actually owned by someone else.
Hmm.
They can litigate not against you, but they have to litigate against me because I warranted to you that this was my own work. You don't bear responsibility for that.
Right. Right. Hmm. Yeah, and so the MPL license takes care of that.
The MPL has that warrant. I like that. I mean, the MPL2 is the license that I think actually Mozilla did a great job on it. It's something they don't get a huge amount of credit for because it was kind of lost in the noise of other things. But I think it's a good license. I think it captures it captures the principles, it captures some of the rules without being onerous. It doesn't try to leap out of its bounds and prevent AWS from coming up with a competing service.
Right.
To me, it is a very reasonable license that captures protections all around. It protects the people that created the project. It makes clear what the spirit of the project is. It makes clear that like the spirit of this project is if you modify it in a way that's useful to you, that should be contributed back.
That's great. Yeah. No, that's awesome. I mean, my favorite example of license gone wrong is the Bash in Mac OS X. I mean, I'm not sure if you're
Yeah,
aware.
no, yeah. Tell me about it. I don't know about it.
Well, Bin Bash in Mac even today is version 3. They could not move to version 4 and 5 because it was distributed under a different license, and so Apple in the latest I think in Big Sur they finally replaced it with ZSH. So now your default shell in OS X is ZSH. It is no longer Bash. And that
Okay, this is explaining something. I was watching someone actually demonstrate something yesterday,
uh,
and what they were demonstrating was kind of silly. But then I'm like, this person's a Zeesh user? They were using Zeesh. I'm like, this is like, because, you know, like Zeesh users, there's a certain like demographic that you associate with Zeesh. And let's just say that like the rest of this person's technical work was not consistent with a Zeesh user. And so I was like, wow, okay, did not see that one coming. But now that makes sense. I didn't, okay, so they're using Zeesh as a replacement for Bash. Wow, okay.
You know what's hilarious is I'm reading this book right now. It's called Originals by Adam Grant. It's a fantastic book. Talks about sort of like what makes how original ideas come about and what makes them tick and how people do that. And I think that in this book they talk about how people who used in the study, people who used Chrome and Firefox have shown statistically better performance at work across all industries, have shown like every metric, and they couldn't figure out why. Of course, the answer is obvious. They went and did something that wasn't the default. They didn't just take on the prescribed solution. And so I think ZSH used to represent exactly that.
ZSH represented the weirdest of that. I mean, ZSH represented the like, no, like there's like the mainstream, the alternative of the alternative. And then there's just like, just the fringe. And ZSH was like from the fringe, I feel.
I don't know. I think fish is the fringe now.
I was going to make a fish reference. Actually, that's what I did. No, I totally think that there was that era of like Cambrian shell explosion. And, everyone kind of agreed that TCSH was, but yeah, Bash kind of conquered all those. But interesting. All right, so Zeesh is now.
Yeah, Zeesh is now a default, and that made my personal life a little bit difficult because I have a framework called Bashmatic, which has basically DSL like functions for all sorts of things, and it wasn't ZSH compatible until recently, so I had to make it work.
There you go. Oh, that's funny. Well, and I think that it's unfortunate because I think Apple then also is at the kind of the outer brink of being very paranoid about some of these licenses and won't touch these licenses that are actually, if you have a lawyer look at them. I mean, I know that they've got they supposedly had an aversion to the cuddle, for example, even though it actually protects them more than say using GPL. And certainly GPL software, they've got a very strong aversion to.
Yeah, I think so. Bash 4 switched to GPL version 3.
And which is that's a dumb decision on their part because the GPL3 represents this very dated idea. It's that rules-based idea of like, no, I don't like people using the software and monetizing it kind of any fashion. So I'm going to come up with more rules to prevent you from doing that. And it's like, it doesn't work. And it's like, look at Apple. Like, all right, great. Apple now, congratulations. Apple doesn't use Bash. Like that sucks. That's not the outcome you wanted.
Yeah, I mean, you can still install it, but it's a pain. But anyway, I don't want to take up too much of your time on Saturday. I really appreciate this was really fun, super interesting. Yeah, and maybe we'll do it again sometime. But thanks so much for giving all the amazing insight and history and anecdotes on the licensing and rights. I really enjoyed speaking with you, and I hope we can do it again.
It'd be great. I love it. I think my own mind is blown on your mind being blown on the internet. That's going to stay with me for a while. That's what a terrific story.
I'll have my mom send me a picture of the globe. She still has it. It's a crystal ball with a golden WWW across.
Oh my God! Yes, that's an heirloom.
At some point, I'm hoping I'll be able to sell it for some number.
No, that is irresponsible to your heirs to sell it. You need to that is priceless, and it needs to be passed down.
Down the generations. That's true.
Exactly right.
People don't understand. The idea that you could have internet awards. Can you imagine? Like today,
I know, it's crazy.
it's fantastic. Yeah. So anyway, thank you so much.
Right. Thank you, Konstantin. So great to see you, and great to catch up as always.
And thanks for letting me record this, and talk to you soon.
Great. Talk to you soon. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.